we all find ourselves in an extraordinary position, an excruciating position. Really, we have awakened in a magnificent and unimaginably beautiful world that is now undergoing its most devastating crisis in the last 65 million years, since the dinosaurs became extinct. And worse, we learn that the source of this current unfolding global devastation is the manner and magnitude in which our own species has been living on this planet. Meanwhile, human civilization itself seems to be beginning to unravel. We can see that humanity is on the brink of collapse, possibly of extinction, possibly of even undermining the prospects for all future life on the earth. And charting the ever-worsening trajectory of all of these trends can be quite disheartening. It's an unfathomable situation that we face, and sometimes it drives us to our knees, weeping. Mysteriously, though, we seem somehow incapable of succumbing to acquiescence or despair. For we know that we are all seeing this and feeling all of this for a reason. Purpose lurks behind the scenes. Surely each one of us in this room has been implicated and is culpable in our shared crisis. But there is much more that blooms in our awareness these days, something far more unsettling. It is as if each of us grappling with these realizations has been sent here precisely at this moment in history because we bear some gift, something unique and necessary, essential. Now, whether this will remain an unopened package remains to be seen, and the world awaits the outcome. Meanwhile, we are caught between two worlds. On the one hand, a cloying and dysfunctional world that perhaps most of us never truly felt a part of. And on the other hand, a new world looming on the horizon that is by turns threatening and exhilarating. Somehow we find ourselves drawn to simultaneously hospice the old and midwife the new, and perhaps even to illuminate the choice between them. And for many of us, this is sometimes terribly disorienting. Ironically, in the face of all of this, we somehow find ourselves called to be leaders, or organizers, or catalysts, or communicators, or facilitators. Others seem to look to us because they sense we see something, or that perhaps we know something, when mostly we just feel. We often respond to this calling reluctantly, hesitatingly, incredulous that it just might somehow come down to us after all. But there is little choice. We know unequivocally we have much work to do, and time is growing very short. Never mind that we do not know if it is already too late. In these dark moments of a waning era, much depends on our response and our ability to find and co-create with others who are similarly called in whatever arena has drawn us together. We are evolutionary catalysts. Otherwise, I don't think we would be here today. There is a future that longs to be born in us and through us, a future that began in the very beginning some 13.7 billion years ago, a future that has been steadily unfolding and accelerating right through to this day. We bear the seeds of that future within us. Where will we plant ourselves? Perhaps, as Peter Senge suggests, if we can find our place, we can find our purpose. Deep transition is about finding our place and about delivering our as yet unnamed gift in our place, hopefully in time. In thinking about this presentation this morning, I wondered what it is that we as evolutionary catalysts might all need to hear, or at least appreciate hearing at this critical moment in this very unique gathering. And I decided that perhaps the place to begin is with our collective predicament and its roots. Of course, people are sometimes very uncomfortable with beginning the conversation this way. After all, as Gus Speth recounts, the authors of the book, The Death of Environmentalism, remind us that Martin Luther King Jr. did not proclaim, "I have a nightmare." They're right, of course, but here is Speth's reply to them. King did not need to say that. His people were living a nightmare. They needed a dream. But we, I fear, are living in a dream. We need to be reminded of the nightmare ahead. He says, "Here is the truth as I see it. We will never do the things that are necessary unless we know the full extent of our predicament." Well, in other venues, such as our Deep Transition Workshop, which we've been developing at Genesis Farm with Miriam McGillis, we occasionally take great care to describe the full extent of our predicament as the context for our work. We speak in terms of things that are peaking in our world and consequently going into decline. Painting the picture of peak energy, for instance, peak climate stability, peak economic growth, peak soil, peak water, peak health, peak food, peak population, and even peak species. This convergence of global crises is what Richard Heinberg calls peak everything, and what James Howard Kunstler calls the long emergency, and what John Michael Greer calls the long descent. And over the last few years, I've noticed that we tend to think of all of these as separate but converging global crises. But of course, they are all deeply interrelated. For instance, our globalized growth economy is based on cheap fossil fuels, and burning fossil fuels is dramatically altering our climate, and we must stop. Therefore, economic growth, as we have known it, cannot and will not continue. The industrial growth society cannot and will not continue. And this is really what we in the transition movement are preparing ourselves and our communities for. But what we rarely speak about is the underlying cause behind peak everything. And saying this seems almost taboo these days. But our converging global crises have but one single cause: our fundamental disconnection from nature, from life, and from spirit, which suggests that any solution that does not address this will not only fail, but will further exacerbate our predicament. And this opens up the second thing that I'd like to talk about today. By way of example, where we at Transition Colorado have begun to come to grips with all this is in the matter of our food supply. We look at the question of root causes. What has caused our food predicament, our codependence on a globalized, industrialized, corporatized, homogenized food system, a system which is highly unsustainable? Why is our food supply having such a devastating impact on human health and on the environment? I'd like to suggest that it's because in relatively recent years we have somehow come to view our food as a commodity. But food is not a commodity. One apple is not substitutable for or as valuable as any other apple. You can't trade calories. Food isn't just about nutrients. And when we really focus on this, we realize that food is one of the primary ways that we connect with life and with nature and with the land and even with the human community. And when our primary food comes from thousands of miles away, is highly processed, is contaminated with chemicals and pesticides and herbicides, and is genetically modified to the point that our bodies have difficulty in recognizing it as food, then we can understand that such food plays a crucial role in daily disconnecting us from life, disconnecting us from nature, disconnecting us from the land, and disconnecting us from our brothers and sisters. Food is sacred. And for those of us who are involved in the shift towards localizing our food supply, we must place this realization right at the center of our work. Or we ourselves, no matter how lofty our intentions, will only contribute to the commoditization of food and our disconnection from life itself. What's astonishing to me, and more than a little embarrassing, is that we had been involved in the local food movement for several years before we were able to begin articulating this. I'd say that we knew it. Perhaps we even took it for granted, but we never actually said it. And then we noticed that no one else was saying it either. We decided it might be very important to begin being very explicit about the sacredness of food and the sacredness of life and the sacredness of the universe that we live in and the sacredness of what it means to be human. And of course, much of what this conference is about is the sacredness of water and the devastating impacts of viewing water as a fungible commodity. And maybe what this conference is really about is sacredness itself. We could spend the rest of the day talking about the meaning and significance and centrality of the sacred, And that's actually very tempting. However, we'll save that for a later deep transition workshop. But the next thing to say, in the face of our collective predicament, is that healing and regeneration are natural, inherent, evolutionary responses that are in fact emerging nearly everywhere in our midst on this planet. And that we evolutionary catalysts are ourselves instruments of that evolutionary force, and thereby instruments of healing and regeneration. At least we have that opportunity and potential responsibility. This is an extremely important realization, and really this evolutionary drive for healing and regeneration, I think, is the only source of hope that has any real grounding these days. The next important thing is to confirm, as the film The Journey of the Universe makes undeniable, that the very evolutionary processes that have been unfolding in the universe for the last 14 billion years and for the last 4.5 billion years on this planet, this rarest of planets, these evolutionary processes are deeply embedded in us as human beings. And now they are beginning to become conscious. And this understanding has developed only very recently in human history, and it changes everything. It's very big news. And our rather revolutionary understanding of the evolution of the universe and of the processes of evolution, all of this has come to us through a long and traceable thread that goes back to Teilhard de Chardin. This awakening has been amplified by people like Jean Gesber, Henri Bergson, and Sri Aurobindo, and in recent decades, Thomas Berry and Brian Swim together have forged a seminal breakthrough in our comprehension, which has been carried forward and amplified by Sister Miriam McGillis and Mary Evelyn Tucker and many others. And meanwhile, there have been other voices who have shown us other syntheses and dimensions in all this, including people like Barbara Marx Hubbard and Michael Dowd and Ken Wilber and Dwayne Elgin and even Andrew Cohen, who has been developing what he calls an evolutionary spirituality. There is something to be learned from all of these pioneers. And there are still others, people who are perhaps far less well known, who have given us a deeper understanding of how the evolutionary process itself unfolds and how we can align with it and embody it. For instance, Arthur Young, the inventor of the first commercially successful helicopter and the author of The Reflexive Universe, The Evolution of Consciousness. And David Sibbett, his American student, who has given us the whole discipline of graphic facilitation, which many of us experienced last night hanging on the wall here, and who also, I would say, broke the code for practical human co-creation. And perhaps most radically, the extraordinary visionary architect, Christopher Alexander, who in recent years has been saying such very radical things as, everything we do is in the service of God. And by God, Alexander means it in the same sense that Stuart Kaufman means in reinventing the sacred, where he forges a common ground between religion and science by defining God not as a supernatural creator, but as the very natural creativity in the universe. It is Arthur Young and David Sibbett and Christopher Alexander in particular whom we draw upon heavily and whose work we build upon in deep transition. The promise and the challenge of deep transition is to begin to understand, align with, and consciously yield to these evolutionary processes, to become conscious agents for evolution, evolutionary catalysts. This turns out to be quite different from being change agents. It is sacred work. And thankfully, we can see the evidence of these evolutionary processes just beginning to become conscious in places like Meg Wheatley's Berkana Institute, in Brian Robertson's Holacracy, in Otto Scharmer's Theory U, in Peter Mary's Evolutionary Leadership, in Bill Mullison's and David Holmgren's Permaculture Movement, in Carlo Petrini's Slow Food Movement, in Woody Tash's Slow Money Movement, even in the Occupy movement, and in the relocalization and transition movement, where we have spent the last 6.5 years doing our field work. Paul Hawken has spoken eloquently about the rapid emergence of awakening individuals and organizations around the world, and how together they represent the planet's immune system beginning to kick in. Well, yes, there are powerful evolutionary forces at work here. Evolutionary catalysts are finding themselves in the most extraordinary situations, and they need support. They need orientation. They need grounding. They need evolutionarily significant tools and processes. They need co-creators. They need communities of practice. And that all just begins to describe what deep transition is all about. Lynette Marie and I have been very fortunate to be involved in perhaps one of the boldest and most creative social experiments in recent times, the transition movement, which began in the UK in 2006 and which is now being explored and refined in more than 400 communities in 34 different countries, 100 of those communities in the US. We were the co-founders of the very first officially recognized transition initiative in North America. And besides doing our own relocalization work up in Boulder County, which we started in 2005 before there was a transition movement, we've been helping evolutionary catalysts in this movement find their footing. And it's been an extremely powerful learning environment, and it has caused us to draw upon parts of ourselves that had been developing in the background for decades, maybe lifetimes. However, deep transition is not about the transition movement, but about evolutionary catalysts wherever we find ourselves emerging. And I'd like to conclude this part of our presentation by sharing a thought that has been having me for the last several months. And it began while listening to Brian Swimm's video series, The Powers of the Universe. Any of you seen The Powers of the Universe? I highly recommend it. We dive pretty deeply into it in our Deep Transition workshop. And what I was listening to was him describing the supernova that created our sun and our solar system. In the universe story, you may recall that Swim and Barry write, when we reflect on the fact that such a supernova explosion of the star Tiamat gave birth to our existence, to our stellar system, that most of the atoms in our body were created by Tiamat and sent to us from its supernova explosion, we begin to recognize that beauty, elegance, and destruction are all layered into our ancestral origin. Our birth required drastic and vehement destruction of well-ordered communities of beings. The supernova event, they say, is simultaneously a profound destruction and yet an exuberant creativity. And as I understand it, in the supernova, a maturing star sacrifices itself in the most magnificent manner imaginable, making possible whole new expressions of evolutionary creativity that simply could not exist before. And from this story, a very uncomfortable thought began to grip me, and sometimes wakes me up in the middle of the night. Could it be that our peak everything, or our long emergency, or long descent is really preparation for humanity's going supernova? And if we're going supernova, what does that mean for the role of the evolutionary catalyst? And I suppose I'm sharing this simply to say that the natural creativity in the universe likely has some profound surprises in store for us, and that we best not hold on too tightly to our notions of things. In other words, perhaps on a larger scale, it's just cataclysm followed by emergence, followed by cataclysm, followed by emergence over and over and over again. That's how evolution works, and that's the process that we as evolutionary catalysts are involved in. We might as well relax and enjoy the journey. Thank you very much. So with that, I'd like to step aside and invite Lynette Marie to provide perhaps a completely different perspective, and I suspect that she has some surprises in store for us as well. Thank you.